Hello, my name is Hunter Gale, and welcome to Soil Health and Sustainable Soil Management. Don't forget to use the chat feature on the right side of the screen. If you have questions or comments as we go along, please feel free to add them there. At the end, we will take a few minutes to answer some of your questions. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Robert Kremer to present Soil Health and Sustainable Soil Management. Dr. Kremer holds a BS and an MS in agronomy from the University of Missouri and a PhD in soil science and biochemistry from Mississippi State University. He is currently a consulting soil scientist and holds courtesy appointments as adjunct professor of soil science at the University of Missouri. In 2014, he retired after a 32-year career as a microbiologist with USDA Agricultural Research Service. He is a prolific author, having co-authored 2 books, 30 book chapters, and authored or co-authored 165 refereed research articles. He began studying soil health in the early 90s and was among the first to show the association of microbial activity with soil health in various agroecosystems. Using biological indicators, his studies demonstrate that good soil health is associated with sustainable agricultural practices. Dr. Kremer's main objective is to move farming toward reduced soil disturbance and fewer chemical inputs that degrade the environment. With that being said, Dr. Kremer, please take it away.
Thank you, Hunter. Okay, we'll just kind of take off from the previous lecture, those of you who attended it, and we'll get into soil biology and its relationship to soil health. Okay, next slide. Soil health is a very complex idea, and we're still trying to grapple on a proper definition. So this is kind of a summary that I've put together, the issue with soil health is the fact that it is relative to the biology and ecosystem services and the environment. You may be familiar with the original term soil quality. That term was really developed in an effort to understand what the best soil productivity situation is in order to maximize agronomic productivity. And there was some sense of maintaining soil properties, but soil health kind of expands on that, and it looking at the functions of the soil, incorporating the biological attributes of biodiversity, food web structure, ecosystem functioning, and the intimate relationships of soil microorganisms with plant and animals. And it focuses on 5 main functions of soil, which are all interactive: the organic matter formation, water relationships, including infiltration, filtration, and storage, atmospheric modification, including carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gases, a habitat for microorganisms, and a medium for plant growth. And we could very well include human health in that as well, because of the issues today with the impacts of conventional farming applications and the greenhouse gas and climate change issues. Next slide. So we look at soil biology. These are the critical properties associated with continuous and vigorously growing vegetation. And with that, we look at soil microbial diversity, or we may refer to it as biodiversity, which is the distribution and the relative abundance of different microbial components. That interacts very intimately with soil carbon content and the quality of that soil carbon. And recall that plant contributions through not only the residues that return to the soil for organic matter formation, but also plant root exudates from living plants that can be upwards of 50 to 60% of the photosynthetically fixed carbon that the plants provide to the soils. And I've got an indication there. Oftentimes we we interchange soil organic matter and soil carbon, just remember that soil organic matter is a substance that is reported on soil test soil test results, but that if you really want to know the actual carbon content, you should consider that soil organic matter component is 58% carbon. So in these pictures, I show a restored prairie where it says native plants provide carbon, nitrogen, and structure to soils, which we've already seen because of its deep rooting nature. In the micrograph to the right, I'm showing the microorganisms in the soil that have colonized the root surface of these plants, where it has a ready access to readily available carbon that is being released through the root. And the small inset shows the circular material there of a micro colony of bacteria on the root surface, which is important because sometimes it takes a group of organisms to accomplish, say, one function. So they have to bind together close like this. But otherwise, they are randomly distributed, or I shouldn't say randomly, they are distributed along the sectors of the root where most of the carbon is being exuded. And we call that root surface the rhizoplane. Next slide, please. This is just an illustration of how the plants feed the soil biology in the soil. So if you look at the tips of these roots, hopefully you should see the red circles at the tips of these roots. And what you see is a droplet of liquid. That droplet contains very soluble carbon, such as sugars and amino acids, that is being released through that root into the soil. So it's something that we see in the field. This is off of a corn plant, and that plant is feeding the soil biology. Next slide. So again, the plant-associated microbiome metabolizes these root-exuded carbon compounds. It then synthesizes plant root substances, root growth substances, which we would call growth regulators, or in the old terminology, hormones. So there's a lot of substances that the microorganisms release that stimulate plant growth, especially root growth, root hair growth, stimulates them to resist pathogens as well. So that's what you see in that left-hand diagram. And then on the right, we don't want to forget that the microbes are also inhabiting inside these roots. We call these endophytic bacteria. Those are the green figures in that red root structure there on the right-hand side. So they establish in roots, and they can most of them are very beneficial. Again, secreting these plant growth regulators, acquiring nutrients that they can secure and pass that on to the plant. Next slide. So the soils, again, this is just a different depiction that I had earlier, shows the numbers of living organisms. This is in a square meter of topsoil, perhaps about 2 to 4 inches deep. And again, so what the most numerous are the bacteria. We keep going down: fungi, algae, nematodes. Get into these mesofauna, the mites, small larvae, earthworms, and spiders. These are all necessary critical components for the biology to function properly in the soil. Next slide. So we often think about, when we fertilize or add compost and manures for plants, we're feeding the plants. But we also need to keep in mind that we need to feed the microbial component in the soil. And this little depiction shows that the amount of microbial biomass in the soil on the average may be equivalent to, several tons of animals on the soil. In this case, we're showing that as cattle. So there may be several tons of microbes under the soil that sometimes we ignore. So it's very important to continue keeping live roots in the soil, or amending with compost and manures, so that we get that carbon substance into the soil and feed this huge amount of microbial biomass that we have in the soil. Upwards, I think I calculated here, 25 tons per hectare, which is 11 tons per acre at 12-inch depth in the soil. Next slide. And again, I showed this earlier, just to remind you that these organisms are spatially distributed. It's a variable distribution. Most of them are near the root, as you can see in the left-hand side, because why? That's where the action is. It's where all the food is coming in from the plant. Outward into this middle section here, which is called the detritosphere, or in other words, old organic matter fractions. We have specialists in there that continue to break this down, but there's not as many. And then out in the bulk soil, which is primarily a root-free zone, you have fewer organisms. So really, as a researcher, we have to think about, where are we going to sample in a field, and what is it going to represent? If you're looking for a general soil population of microbes, you don't necessarily want to just sample where soil roots are, or plant roots are. You maybe need to go between the row. These are the things that need to be considered with this type of work. Next, please. So this just depicts, in actuality, where these organisms are in terms of the root zone. It's very difficult to see, though, with depth in this gray portion of the micrograph. But in the micrograph C here, you can see the bacteria that in these biofilms. They're very gummy, so they're not very defined, but organisms particularly do that on roots, is to cover themselves with biofilm. It helps them access nutrients better, and it protects them from environmental stresses. And these others show that as well. It's not as good. Some of in E, you see the fungal strands that are down there, but it's a very complex situation with the underground microbiome. Next slide. Okay, so this is probably the most important slide of the presentation, and it is talking about the soil food web. And the soil food web is essential for environmental functioning and ecosystem services, because it takes all these organisms working together to have a properly functioning soil. And so what do you see in the middle of this web is a plant and its roots going into the soil. And the first level of organisms around that soil is what we have been discussing already: the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa that are there, that needs to take up these materials, release plant growth hormones, and as they break down some of the organic matter, release nutrients, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium, that can be easily taken up by the plant. In the next circle that is outside, we see some of the predators of the bacteria and fungi that are near the roots. This serves as population regulation, so that no particular species or group gets out of control. But also what it does, as they prey on bacteria and fungi, they digest these, and then they release the nitrogen and phosphorus from those microorganisms that are then, what is not used by the predator is released, and it is available for other organisms and the plant for uptake as well. The further we get out there, the nematodes, and about that third tier out there, third trophic level, nematodes, more protozoa, the microscopic insects such as Columbella, they also prey on protozoa and fungi, doing the same thing, recycling nutrients. But this is the start where we begin to involve what is called the soil engineers. They provide the pore space in the soil. They line it with gums and really help aerate and have good water infiltration through there. And then further, as we go out to the earthworms, the other larger insects, and even the shrews and moles help provide a good soil habitat for everything that's going on in the overall soil biology. Also want to note that we get back to the first trophic level there, that we have phages and viruses that are also involved in maintaining the population of microorganisms, and also transferring genetic material for passing on certain genes to other bacteria. So now in the red here, I have, oh, and one other thing I want to show you. Up in the upper right-hand corner, the megafauna, the arthropods and all the insects that are on the surface, above the soil surface, are very important in either breaking down some of the plant leaves and things, litter that may go into the soil, pollination, a lot of other activities that go on that's critical, that we often don't associate with the soil microorganism, but they are very important. And it's important to know that they are being vulnerable to many climate change scenarios and management as we speak, and they are being depleted unless we start doing something to reverse that. So at these arrows, then I show where the soil food web is very vulnerable to management, vulnerable to environmental stresses, climate instability, greenhouse gases, all affect these different components in the soil food web. For instance, just the fact of tillage in some of our production fields will damage the fungal, because fungi are filamentous, and they are binding up soil particles. We can have an indirect effect on that. Also, the earthworms, which provide pores and move microbes around, tillage is very damaging to them as well. Not to mention all the different chemicals, such as the fungicides, the insecticides, and herbicides that make their way into soil, can have a very detrimental effect on the soil components of the soil food web, and can disrupt the activity of the food web very much in a drastic measure. Next slide, please. I showed this earlier, that the soil food web is necessary to build up soil organic matter. This is after a prairie was reconstructed over time with deep rooting by the plants as shown in this column here on the right. We can build soil organic matter with a good functioning soil food web, and the plants that are in the center of that food web build soil organic matter up over a 10 to 15 year period, going from a 2% amount to over 6%. So this is where the soil food web is very functional. Next slide. So also along, if we think of it in the 3 dimensions and look at the depth aspect here with these organisms associated with deep-rooted plants, that you can see the root going down this soil profile column here, what they can do is, as they are decomposing the plant residues, they are releasing carbon compounds that can be sequestered. Carbon storage is a very important issue now. Try to keep the carbon dioxide down, not only at the surface depth in that A horizon, but also as you go lower, that carbon dioxide is being sequestered and stored as stable organic matter at depth, which is a very important component of not only the organisms themselves, but also the soil food web associated with these deep-rooted plants. Next, please. The arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi are quite important in 90% of plant growth, or are able to associate with this particular symbiotic fungus. You can see the lower right panel. You can see the infection of the mycorrhizae in the roots with these structures that are in the root cells that exchange for plant carbon. Their mycelia or filaments will go out into the soil, access phosphorus, and bring that in for the plant to use in exchange for the carbon. So this is a very important organism that should be a part of the microbiome in the soil. It's a multifunctional organism. It supplies plants with many nutrients. It is able to bring water in from at distance from the roots for the plants. They also produce antibiotic type compounds that can suppress root pathogens in exchange for the plant carbon. And they also contribute to the structure of soil by aggregating soil with their mycelia. And there's now some research showing that they may reduce greenhouse gases by competing with denitrifying bacteria in the soil that are responsible for producing some of these nitrous oxides. Next, please. So we got to think about a succession of microorganisms in the soil because as especially in transitioning, say from a intensive monoculture type practice, such as continuous corn or corn rotated with soybean, which is really a very poor rotation. As we transition, you start using cover crops or bringing in perennial vegetation such as prairies and pastures. You see in the fallow soil that we see on the left here of this arrow, we have a very non-diverse microbiome. Have a lot of yeasts, which are fungi and other fungi. Then, as you get into continuous crops and or corn and soybean, you do get some of these other microbes, but then you begin to build up plant pathogens. You know, why do you think we have BT corn that's engineered? Why do they put neonicotinoids, insecticides on seeds when they're planted? It's because over time we've built up pathogens. But then you start putting in cover crops with that rotation, you build up the diversity in the soil, as you can see towards the right-hand side of this arrow. Bring in that mycorrhizae fungi and other mycelial groups and antagonistic bacteria, especially the actinomycetes, which have been known to produce antibiotics for many years. And then you have something that is aggressive towards these pathogens, and you can reduce the inputs of these very toxic chemicals that are often used in conventional agriculture. Next, please. This is a diagram, function of a healthy or fully active soil food web. We've broken down this into simpler groups, functional groups on the left-hand side. The chemical engineers, which are the bacteria and fungi, they regulate most of the energy flow and they stimulate plant growth. They make the antibiotics, and they are really the only ones that can break down some of these materials in the soil and make mineralize nitrogen and phosphorus from the residues and make it available to the plant. Then we have the biological regulators. Remember, we had the protozoa and small invertebrates, the nematodes. They regulate these populations of soil organisms by grazing on them, preying and parasitism, and basically recycle the nutrients that was accessed by the bacteria and fungi of the chemical engineers, and then recycle it back to them and the plant. And then finally, the ecosystem engineers. They're the ones that form the good structure, aggregation, and aeration and water infiltration in the soil. And these include the plant roots, the earthworms, some of the inverts, caterpillars, and these other small insects. Next, please. Okay, so let's get a little bit into what we're looking for when we're assessing a soil for soil health or a field for soil health. It's a comprehensive assessment based on sensitive indicators representing all the properties, physical, chemical, and biological. This can include bulk density, aggregate stability, topsoil depth on the physical side. On the chemical side, it can include soil organic matter, the active carbon fraction, pH, the exchangeable nutrients, and then on the biological, microbial biomass, biodiversity, microbial activity, which can be measured by enzyme activity. So these are the types of measurements that can be worked into a model to come up with a soil health index. We haven't been very good with that yet because only about 20 has enough of a data set in order to do that, but I will show you a little bit of what we found to this point. Next, please. Okay, so there is a model called a soil management assessment framework, and we have done this to many sites across the state of Missouri. Um, and we use selected soil health indicators to come up with this, plug it into what you would call a model, and come up with a soil health index, which we see on the x-axis or the left-hand side of the graph. And it goes from either 0 to 1 or 1 to 100. It just depends on however you want to do it. And of course, what you see anywhere where you have continuous vegetation, you have the highest soil health index, which is not a big surprise. What's interesting, the second bar from the left here with the red asterisk shows that it was a triticale cover crop with legumes, had a very high soil health index, but the additional component there was that it was being grazed by sheep. And grazing is a very uh, soil health improving management practice, and it was shown here. All these other bars that we show here are from rotations, are from a reconstructed prairies that we see at about level of between 0.85 and 0.9 health index. And then, as you can see here, the other asterisk bar in the middle of the graph is a native prairie at about 0.85. You would expect this to be higher, but the reason that it is low is because it is from a Tucker Prairie, which is in the middle of the state on I-70, past east of Columbia, and it is established on what we call a clay pan soil. And that clay pan soil um, retains a lot of moisture from spring rains, so it's very wet in the spring. It has a lot of organic matter in it where it is undergoing anaerobic decomposition, and the pH there can be as low as 4.0 to 4.5. And that's the reason why that is low at that point, because of the lower pH, which is one of the soil health indices that says that the optimum pH is 7.0. So you run into these kinds of things. I'll point one more thing. The lowest bar, of course, is something that is continuous cropping and tillage. And that just wrecks soil health for these fields that are managed in that manner. Next, please. So the generalized effects on management of soil health are things that tend to reduce soil health in the red, tends that promote trend to promote soil health in the green. And it's just, what you'd expect: aggressive tillage versus no-till, annual seasonal continuous cropping versus cover crops and relay crops, monocropping versus diverse crops, annual versus perennials, and on down the line. And it's just a kind of a logical approach. When you come to a field and you know what management's going on, you can kind of tell what to expect in a soil health assessment. Next. We've already looked at this soil mycorrhizae. The one thing we're going to show here, I'm going to go through some of the management now that you can be used to adjust soil biological function and soil health. This is from a cover crop study where they used mixtures which had winter wheat, clover, vetch, turnip, radish. They planted that in the fall, and what it did was a little bit unexpected. It increased the abundance and diversity of mycorrhizae in the soil, which you can see by this taller bar here, and it allowed it to be present for the next crop that was coming in the subsequent year. So it's like inoculating the soil using these cover crops in an indirect manner. And what you see here, none. There was no cover crop, and that succeeding crop did not have as much mycorrhizae infection as the one that followed the cover crops. Next. Intercropping is something that should be considered. This is something that we've been dealing with looking at some commodity crops, especially corn. But if we integrate and use wide row cropping, what this does, and we've showed this, is that the corn in here can capture a lot more carbon dioxide in photosynthesis. And what that does is provide nutrients to the soil, better soil microbiome. And then we can come in and intercrop. In this case, on the left is oats, on the right is cowpea, summer crop versus a spring winter crop. And that will increase the diversity of the field. And those different plants will also increase the diversity of the soil microbiome and increase soil microbial diversity. It's a very interesting way. And sometimes if you can select the proper hybrids of corn, you can almost get the same yield with a 6-inch row as you do with the standard 30-inch rows. So this is a particular intercropping scheme that we've been working on. Next, please. Another way, in addition to mycorrhizal inoculation and intercropping and cover crops, is organic amendments. There are multiple beneficial functions of this. It can serve as a nutrient source. It can build up soil organic matter, and it's a source of soil biological activity. This is an analysis of a compost from Prairie Birthday Farm. It has a very good carbon nitrogen ratio of about 15, which is what you want to be very active. It has a number of nutrients in that compost, but what's most interesting, where this is circled in red, is a very high biological activity due to the microorganisms that are in that compost. So what happens when you amend the soil, say if it's in your garden or lawn, you can actually inoculate with the organisms in this soil and get this kind of activity and be much more productive than with your basic soil as it is. Next. So what is it about organic materials? This is a diagram based on what we've already talked about. But if you follow on the right, adding organic materials into the soil, what you do is you activate the microbial communities. Not only are you adding organic matter, but you can release these nutrients for soil: phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen. Growth regulators mobilize micronutrients, iron, copper, and zinc, suppress pathogens, and also induce stress tolerance, where these microbes can colonize the roots and protect them from heat and moisture stress. So if you use an inorganic fertilizer, such as say ammonium nitrate, which I know is hard to get anymore, you're providing N, as you do for the organic materials, but you may be depleting soil organic matter, very toxic to some fungi, and there's also the potential for loss of soluble nitrogen into the soil. You really don't get any of these other biological benefits that we see on the right-hand side of the slide there. So, as is said as it has been stated, chemical fertilizers may feed the plant, but organic fertilizers feed the soil. And I think that's what this depicts right here. Next, please. Continuing with some intercropping, this is an integrated perennial cover crop with prairie grasses and forbs in the alleys of an organic orchard in Clay County. So what you see is a lot of tall grasses and forbs, and then we have the fruit trees here on the upper half of the slide. Good fruit production. Not only the soil organisms are keeping the pathogens down from the roots, but is also serving as a source for pollinators and predatory insects that keep the insect pests and pathogens down in the fruit orchard itself. Next. So this is an example of a soil microbial community assessment that we use in conjunction with soil health. And what this shows is the microbial structure under an organic orchard field. It's actually the one that we saw in the previous slide with the native plants in the alley. And we get information on very broad groups of these microorganisms. As you can see in the legend here, protozoa, mycorrhizae, saprophytic fungi, actinobacteria, and the gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria. So if you look at a cultivated site on this very far right, this shows up as very low abundance biomass of all these components in a cultivated field. This was again, a corn soybean field that was adjacent to this organic farm. And then if you look in the middle, we have an organic, or third bar from the left, an organic orchard, very high in almost all of these components, including the mycorrhizae, which is the second color, the blue color from the top. And this is even stimulated more so in the organic, two bars over, the organic alley plus BC, which is biochar. The biochar really stimulated the microbiome here. We got high components of bacteria and the actinomycetes in that green section, which is very helpful in suppressing pathogens, and the mycorrhizae as well. So we use this information to help us understand the soil health as being affected by the diversity and the abundance of the soil microbiome. Next. On the other hand, we can look at the carbon distribution in a farm. This is a very busy poster, but I just wanted to show you that we can assess the amount of carbon being fixed by the veg itself. In this case, we're looking at trees, and also down below here, the soil carbon that is being mediated by the soil microorganisms. And we can come up with a whole carbon profile that can be helpful in understanding the carbon sequestration going on, and can be used eventually in carbon credit plans. And again, it just illustrates the importance of having a very functional soil microbiome, because they are working on sequestering this carbon in a very resourceful manner. Next, please. Another intercropping with agroforestry. This is where we looked at a perennial cover cropping with a plant known as Kura clover in a pecan orchard. This was very important because it's on one of these rolling landscapes on the Missouri River Hills in Sheraton County, Missouri. So it was on a hilly landscape, and usually with pecans, this veg is managed very closely to the soil. But what this farmer found was that he could get another crop in there with the clover while the pecans were maturing, either as hay or haylage, or even graze it. He's also used it as a seed crop, but it also reduced erosion. It contributed to the overall soil microbial activity in the soil, and it was an overall good management practice to have with an intercropped agroforestry crop. Next. On the trip to Brazil, we had some citrus orange management problems they were having there. They were typically, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, this is an orange grove. They would keep the alleys bare, and they would use Roundup herbicide, the glyphosate herbicide, and they were wondering why they were getting so much fruit fall and citrus problems, citrus fruit quality. And then one of the agroecologists down there convinced the owner to use a grass alley, and then they could go through in here and mow it and blow the mulch into the tree row, and they had a considerably improved citrus production at this orchard. So, and again, the soil biology here was much improved over a bare soil that you see here. Next, please. So it's very important to use native plants to maintain the environment. This is the Iowa prairie strip system up in southern Iowa, where they've used prairie strips in conjunction with conventional row cropping. And over the years, they found that the prairie strips had 95% loss of soil due to erosion, soil export, 82% less nitrogen runoff, 80% less phosphorus. And these are very important contaminants. And as you know, in Iowa, they have huge problems with runoff polluting the rivers up there that eventually makes its way into the Mississippi River. Now, how often or how widespread this practice has been adopted is not known, but it's an ideal way, especially if this is subsidized by NRCS, to maintain soil and improve that soil health, because we need to keep this topsoil on the ground, as well as the organic matter and the microbial communities. Next, please. So this just kind of shows you, with an undisturbed versus so-called domesticated soil, in other words, intensively cropped soil, how much topsoil can be lost to erosion compared to the undisturbed. You see here the top bar, a lot is being eroded. You can see the thickness of the arrows are going off. And then what happens, loss of carbon dioxide and loss of organic matter, then you get more respiration, you get more carbon dioxide driven off, and nutrients leached into the soil, is the red arrow at the bottom here, compared to the undisturbed soil. This is just a very good illustration of poor management that is degrading our soils, when indeed, if you had undisturbed soils, even if it's just to the use of no-till and cover crops, would be much improvement over these intensively tilled soils. Next, please. Grazing, this is a grazing of buffalo or bison the way it used to be in the native prairies, say thousands of years ago, or until the European settlers came. Integrated grazing with pastures or on the native prairie improves soil health considerably. Next, please. Okay, so this is a very busy table. Take a look at this when this is posted, but the management for functional soil health is what we've kind of looked through or talked about. There's diverse crop rotations, minimize the soil disturbance, reduce tillage, compaction, pesticide inputs, which is a disturbance, limited crop residue removal, increased soil aggregation, and enhanced retention of carbon and nitrogen. Crop diversity, either by multi-species cover crop mixes, which stimulate microbial growth and enhance carbon accumulation. Intercropping to capture more sunlight and carbon dioxide for greater introduction of root carbon into organic matter. Organic amendments, the manures, compost, the biochar we talked about. Crop residues stimulates the soil food web and enhances fungi. Maintain continuous cover, enhance soil carbon accumulation, better water content. We didn't talk much about this, but using biostimulants, especially those that are effective to stimulate crop root growth, suppress detrimental organisms, impart stress tolerance. And there's many biostimulants out there that are organic approved. And then just having what I found out recently is known as ecosystem connectivity. In other words, having native plant buffers, strips, riparian strips, incorporate these strips in the crop field, because you can connect these ecosystems where you have beneficial organisms, including the insects and mycorrhizae, that can carry over into the crop strips of the production field. Next. Oh, so finally, this is a little bit on how is soil health related to food health or food quality. We know the soil microbial community with sustainably managed systems may be more effective in mediating biological processes to achieve soil health and impact food production relative to conventionally managed sites. So it's very likely that improved soil health contributes to higher quality foods compared with conventional counterparts. The problem is there hasn't been a whole lot of this done. I know the lab in Fairfield, Iowa, HRI Labs, which does a lot of food quality and pesticide work, has shown that organic systems do have a certain higher fruit quality, grain quality. Some of the omega fatty acids are improved when you have higher soil health. Here's one I'm going to throw out that is recent, that hasn't been attracting a lot of attention, but I think could be very important, is that we look at soil health that practices that reduce tillage and low pesticide inputs. They nurture these soil fungal components, which includes those that produce beneficial compounds, including antioxidants. There's this one known as ergothioneine, is produced by the fungi, It's taken up through the roots of plants and concentrates in many food grains. And this compound decreases neurodegenerative conditions, decreases cardiovascular disease risk, lowers risks of certain cancers. This is a picture of it down here. It's a glorified amino acid. It's a very unique aspect because this is something that does not require genetic modification to produce such healthy uh, products or nutraceuticals in plants. It's just simply a matter of maintaining soil health and these beneficial fungi that produce these beneficial, healthy substances. Next, please. A few references. I'll be getting more references to Tammy to post, but that's the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kremer. Another enlightening presentation. Had no idea it was such a complex world beneath our feet.
Right.
How big picture optimistic are you about the future of industrial agriculture? And do you, in your experience, see a lot of our food production acknowledging this new kind of understanding of soil health?
Yes, well, there is, and some of the industrial or commodity type agriculture farmers are they're embracing cover crops because there's a payment for it, of course, and no tillage. Tillage is reduced quite a bit, but there's only about between 30 and 40% of farmers have completely adopted no-till. You can still go across the state or across the Midwest in the springtime and see a lot of some tillage that really is not necessary. But also some of the commodity organizations, like the Soybean Association and some of the big food commodity processors like Cargill and ADM, they're coming up with programs for soil health to show that they are concerned and involved about it. But the big deal is that we still have these large acreages of commodity agriculture, and that is what's supported primarily through the government payments, crop insurance, and the big ag, the big corporate ag, not only the food, the grain, but equipment and seed and chemical producers. So it's going to be a while, I think, before we have a complete change in our current agricultural production system. I mean, where we can grow a diversity of crops. Like when I grew up on the farm, we grew 8 or 10 crops and had, 4 or 5 different types of livestock. That's the way it used to be, and it worked very well. And a lot of these things that, say Regen Ag and Soil Health wants to do are things that we used to do, but we just don't do anymore. I'm optimistic that a portion of agriculture community will accept and embrace some of these practices and start beginning improving soil health. But I think it's going to be a long haul.
Okay. And then when it comes to cover crops, is there a specific set that is far and away better to use, or is it all site specific based on what the soil in a specific location requires?
It's not really gotten down to that kind of detail yet, but there are certain crops that are easier to deal with, to manage than others. But primarily, a good cover crop mix would have 4 or 5 different species in it, a grass like a cereal rye and a legume like vetch or Austrian winter pea. And then a lot of guys are using these brassicas, such as forage radish or turnip or mustards and this kind of thing, because they tend to accumulate nitrates and phosphorus to keep it from running off. and then once it's terminated and followed by another crop, that those nutrients are released, and it should help on your fertilizer bill. But when you use it in a conventional setting, there's certain cover crops should be used, say, before soybeans, like cereal rye, rather than corn, because you have two of the same type. These are things that are still under development. Some guys really get into it. I was with a project where he wanted to use an 18 cover crop mix, which was really bizarre, but it's it does give you that diversity, especially if you consider that most of those crops have their own root microbiome. So that will help.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Another question came in. It says, "Thank you for your presentation. I work to manage a trail system on the site of an old cement quarry. There are areas where the topsoil is completely scraped away. What would be the best practice for starting to restore this type of area?"
Yeah, if it's that degraded, you'd probably want to start hauling in some organic mulches or materials like compost. That would be be pretty expensive to do. That kind of depends on how big of an area it is, but maybe try to mix that kind of thing in. I could get them in touch with the urban gardening community here. They did something very similar where they converted an old fairground that had chat roads in it, and they didn't want to use raised beds or anything like that. So they managed to get mulches and wood chips and things like that in there, and then used restricted incorporation with tillage, and they got it started that pretty well, and it's been a couple of years, and that's starting to look pretty good.
Okay. Another question came in. Are the graphic charts that you utilized in your presentation available somewhere?
Well, yeah, some of them come out of publications that we've published. Others are in my PowerPoint files that I can convert to PDF, depending on what you want to use them for. I can get you a better quality than what was on here today, but I thought they showed up pretty well. I think you have my email address. Anybody can contact me if they wish to more information like that.
Thank you. Another question I had: would you recommend? Is there a percentage of if you're farming with crops, a percentage that is best to use for perennial? Let's say if you were to plant perennials in rows, um, is it just basically as much as you can? Do you want to try to aim for maybe a ideal balance of a fourth in perennial rows and then the 3/4 in grown crop?
Yeah, right. That's something that probably needs a lot more work. I mean, right now, if you can get perennials in the 20-foot buffer that you should have along your field, along a forest or a stream bank, that that kind of thing is working well now for those who wish to give up that amount of space from from conventional crops. So you could think of it in that respect. I wouldn't think they'd have to be exactly 20 feet, but things like in areas where you have potential erosion, excellent place to put perennial grass strips or alfalfa. That kind of thing works very well. I've been working with a sweet clover, which I know is probably not a favorite of conservationists, but it sure does very well with horticultural crops and keeping down um, some of the insect pests that I've been having. So, like the wide intercrops that I've been using, the 60-inch areas, we're going to try perennials on that, and then we can kind of alternate crops on either side of those every year. That seems to be a possibility as well.
Okay. And then, do you recommend? Is it do I understand correctly? Soil tests once a year are appropriate, or is it typically recommended to do it a little more often, a little less often?
No, your standard soil test you should do one every 1 or 2 years, and that the standard is mainly your main nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, potassium, organic matter, and that pH, of course. Yeah, you should be checking that. I think more often, but I think one that part of the test that people don't hardly ever use is that of micronutrients, because micronutrients are very important. They're in almost every enzyme system in both microbes and plants. And I know a lot of soil scientists will argue with me, but we are deficient in many micronutrients, such as boron, copper, molybdenum, these kinds of things. And they are very important for the plant to have access to. So that soil test ought to be made at least every 3 to 5 years to see what you're doing. To see what the status is. And if you're insufficient on those, some of these deep-rooted cover crops can actually bring those up from beyond the rooting depth of the crop and get them into the upper horizon. If that's not possible, there are some good foliar fertilizer applications that contain these micronutrients that you can apply to the growing crop in season. So I know that was a little bit longer than you were asking, but that is my opinion at this point.
Okay, I appreciate that. And do I understand correctly if you are properly using cover crops, that you may not need to add other soil amendments, or will you always kind of have to be doing a little bit of both?
Um, I mean, if you're consistently using cover crops, you could probably reduce and maybe not use any other amendment. Well, are you talking about organic amendments, right?
Correct.
Or yeah, yeah, you could probably cut back on your organic amendments, to maybe once every couple of years. The other important thing I tried to stress was maintaining your if you're doing crops, maintaining your crop residues left over remaining after harvest, because if you don't have your cover crop established, then at least you have that as a source of organic matter and keeping the soil covered as well. But the cover crops following that really help to decompose the remaining main crop residues, because it supports these microbial communities. Here's the thing about cover crops: is the idea is to keep everything, all the biomass that's produced, keep that on that soil in that field. Or you can graze it if you have the ability to fence some cattle or sheep in the field to graze the cover crops. They recycle that material; it stays in the field as well. But there's a lot of guys that will plant a cover crop, and wheat is a popular cover crop for this. Winter wheat in Missouri is being planted about now or in a few weeks, and then these guys will cut that for hay in the spring, and so you're taking all that biomass off of there and a lot of the nutrients that you captured for hay. So
Yeah.
you almost have to supplement your with fertilizers when you no-till the next crop into that cover crop that was harvested for hay. So you're kind of defeating the purpose.
Sure, sure. That makes perfect sense. Okay. Um, uh, I guess have time for one more. Well, yeah, one more question. Uh, the perennial cover crop of native prairie grasses and forbs that was in the row with the orchard, I believe you have
Mhm.
a picture of. I'd never seen that before, and uh, I guess uh, I would ask, do you know, is that something that you see people beginning to utilize more often?
Not a whole lot. That was at Prairie Birthday Farm where Linda Hetzel's got her farm, and she's the one that did that. Um, I suppose in some areas it is being done. Um, but the idea is that you have that deep rooted native plants in there. It's just an ideal situation. The only drawback is it's very difficult to harvest the fruit. So,
Sure. Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
so I mean, if you have the patience and you have a way to do that, and they do have a way catching it in nets and that kind of thing, but it's probably suited right now for a smaller operation.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Kremer, and thank you to our viewers. Want to remind everybody to please take a moment to fill out the session evaluation and let us know what you thought. Uh, if you have more questions for Dr. Kremer, please join his office hours, switching over right now at 4. And I'll remind you that our next sessions are starting tomorrow at 8 a.m. While you wait, please visit our exhibitor chats or check out our generous sponsors. If you want to listen to the session again or catch one that you missed, Planet Native 2022 is recording all sessions, and you'll have access to the recordings for 1 year to watch as much as you'd like. Thank you once again.
All right. Thank you, Hunter. Thank you all.